Hello, and welcome to Take Two. This series riffs on a few movies that follow the theme of the episode, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. Each episode will look at the directing choices, the acting, the structure of the story, and everything in between. My name's Emily Pinto, and I'll be your host. For our first episode, we're covering socially aware horror movies. We'll start with two little films you may have heard of, Silence of the Lambs and Get Out. Stick around to the end, and you'll see why we're going a bit mainstream this episode. Visceral and entertaining to audiences throughout the ages, horror has proven a staple genre of cinema since its inception. The silent era is full of classics like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Phantom of the Opera. But horror can be far more than stories about scary monsters and those terribly heroic heterosexual men who overcome them. Silence of the Lambs and Get Out use horror to explore social issues. These films are character studies on the protagonist, seeing how they're able to not only overcome the typical challenges a horror film poses, but also live in a society that fundamentally challenges their identity. We're going to spoil the endings of these movies, so if you haven't seen them, give them a watch and then kindly come back here. Let's start with Silence of the Lambs. Now, everyone praises Anthony Hopkins' 24-minute Oscar-winning performance as Hannibal Lecter. But there's far more to the film's other 94 minutes. Namely, Clarice Starling, the female FBI agent struggling through a toxic, masculine workspace. Let's not forget, though people always do, that Clarice is the actual hero of Silence of the Lambs. From the credit sequence, we're drawn into a narrative that focuses on Clarice's struggles to make a place for herself at the FBI. Before the first words of the dialogue are spoken, we see Clarice put great effort into her FBI training. She pushes through treacherous forest terrain, determined to prove her worth as an agent. A 2015 internal FBI survey showed that there were only 2,610 female agents, compared to the 10,831 male agents. Fittingly, the film does give Clarice an opportunity to demonstrate her worth, in the form of a high-profile case. She must catch serial killer Buffalo Bill, who has kidnapped the senator's daughter. Throughout the film, she encounters many threats related to her gender. When she visits the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, she has an insane man flick semen at her. Even amongst law enforcement, she encounters gender-related condescension from local sheriffs, which her boss, Jack Crawford, explicitly enables. The visual style of the film supports the fact that it is preoccupied with how a woman is perceived in a predominantly male field of work. We literally see through Clarice's eyes as all the other characters stare directly into the camera whenever looking at her. The POV shot, used more and more frequently, becomes threatening and off-putting. As they gaze straight into the lens, all the males, from the serial killer Hannibal Lecter to her boss, Jack Crawford, assert their gaze over Clarice and, by extension, the viewer. The fact that the shots are low angle constantly reminds us that Clarice is physically smaller than these men, regardless of whether they're hardened criminals or officers of the law. The most memorable use of this cinematic technique is in Clarice's first meeting with Hannibal Lecter. When she visits the Baltimore State Hospital to interview him, she is led into a darkened cell block. She finds Lecter standing still, with a glass panel as the only thing dividing the two. He seems completely ready for her, while she is still trying and failing to get a read on him. As Lecter beckons Clarice to draw closer, she submits. The POV shot works to great effect here. The scene progresses to tighter and tighter shots, feeling claustrophobic. As the scene goes on, we eventually start to forget that the glass panel divides them. Though caged and without a weapon of any kind, Hannibal Lecter still feels very dangerous to Clarice and the audience. But despite his initial insults, Lecter winds up being quite sympathetic to Clarice. The true villain of the tale, Buffalo Bill, is the embodiment of all the men who threaten Clarice. Buffalo Bill assaults, kidnaps, murders, and ultimately mutilates women in the name of becoming a woman himself. In the film's eyes, Buffalo Bill, a man who desperately kills in order to transform into a woman, is an unnatural perversion of womanhood. On the other hand, the film sees Clarice as a normal person who accepts her natural gender, though it causes her more difficulty in this case and the FBI in general. Put simply, she's everything that Buffalo Bill wishes he was. When Clarice shoots Buffalo Bill at the end, the film thematically shows her vanquishing this false woman. More recently, Get Out has struck a chord with audiences and critics. At the beginning of Get Out, our black protagonist Chris is about to travel out of town to meet his white girlfriend's parents and extended family. It's like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but actually entertaining. Yet an undercurrent of dread permeates the film, which opens with a different black man getting attacked in a supposedly safe suburban neighborhood. There are echoes of the Trayvon Martin incident as no one comes to his aid. Get Out focuses on its protagonist's identity as a black man in America. Even an encounter between Chris and a policeman in the first few minutes is blatantly uncomfortable. A subsequent party scene has people awkwardly complimenting Chris's physique, all the while pretending to be very liberal and progressive. The truth is horrifying. The community wants to literally put a white person's mind in Chris. In a weird body horror twist, black bodies are being mentally enslaved for the pleasure of white elites. Chris's girlfriend, Rose, has lured him out here for what she perceives as the greater good of the community, not because she cares about him. Chris must fight his way out of a white community, resorting to bloody methods in the name of escape. In his brutal but deserved dispatch of his treacherous girlfriend and family, he fulfills societal stereotypes of the violent black man, but we understand exactly what has led him to make all these choices. The film is less overtly stylized than Silence of the Lambs, but it does have an inventive recurring visual. When Chris is hypnotized by Rose's mother, he finds himself in the sunken place. The sunken place is an abstract area where Chris seems to be floating in space. His pleas all are ignored as a sliver of the real world remains just out of his reach. All this visually communicates the sort of helplessness that people of color may feel. They can scream all they want, but they're trapped in a place in which no one acknowledges what they're saying. A study kept by the Washington Post revealed that last year, 223 black people were killed by the police. But if you're looking for chinks in the progressive armor, these two movies aren't without their flaws. While Silence of the Lambs acknowledges the struggles of an independent woman trying to make a career for herself in a male-dominated world, it also completely demonizes Buffalo Bill, a man who seeks to make the transition into womanhood. After all, he skins his victims, using these women for his grotesque skin suit. At the time, the LGBTQ community was outraged, feeling it to be an assertion of an old stereotype that transgender people were mentally unstable. Just look back at the 80s. Films like Cruising and Dressed to Kill have homosexual men and transgender men, respectively, turn out to be the culprit of gruesome homicides. Even Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho used this trope, as Norman cross-dressed as his mother whenever he killed people. Director Jonathan Demme chose to make his next film project, Philadelphia, following a homosexual lawyer with AIDS. This, he hoped, would serve as a long-winded apology. Worse is the fact that the franchise undervalued the contribution of the original film's heroine. Hannibal Lecter became the star of every subsequent movie, which grew less successful. The producers didn't bother to keep Jodie Foster in the role of Clarice Starling. In Get Out, the film is ultimately undercut by the decision to go with a crowd-pleasing finale. As it is, his TSA friend abruptly comes to the rescue. The original ending, filmed by director Jordan Peele and changed before release, focused on police being discriminatory towards African Americans. This ending would pay off earlier scenes that alluded to authority figures being apathetic towards our hero's plight. These include the encounter between Chris and a cop, as well as another sequence where his friend seeks police help only to be rebuffed. A film built on a distrust of authority now ends with a representative of a government entity, the TSA, saving the day. A more charitable person would argue they didn't want to end on a depressing note. After all, there's never, ever been a classic with a sad ending. But perhaps, as a film produced by the guy who did hit horror films, Ouija and Truth or Dare, Get Out lost the courage to take its premise seriously and follow the story to its realistic conclusion. Perhaps due to their essential nature as Hollywood-backed films, supposed to please an audience and make money, these films do have faults. So let's look instead at George Romero's Dead Trilogy, socially conscious horror movies made independently on a low budget and far from Hollywood. The first, Night of the Living Dead, has a black protagonist, which was still unique in the 1960s. Throughout the story, Ben proves himself to be intelligent and capable. The young, dashing white hero is killed off in an explosion due to his own stupidity, and the middle-aged white father makes similarly terrible decisions. Tragically, Ben meets an untimely demise, not at the hands of zombies, but rather Hicks, who don't bother to see if he's a zombie or not. The second film, Dawn of the Dead, continues its blunt but honest statements on race as well as gender. Out of a film with 4 main characters, the 2 white men die when they both callously step into conflict. Instead of rewarding these characters for their blind machismo like most movies would, Romero punishes them. No Hollywood happiness here. These characters become zombies and are dispatched brutally. Only Fran and Peter, a pregnant journalist and a skilled African-American police officer, escape alive. Day of the Dead, which takes place in a military base, completes Romero's trilogy. The toxicity of the male characters borders on parody. The captain of the base screams his every line, while the head scientist seems to have gone insane experimenting with zombies. The female protagonist, Dr. Sarah Bowman, is the most clear-minded, rational leader in all of the film, and for that, she survives all the way to the end. These movies with their extreme gore and dark tone aren't for all audiences, but the ones that can handle them may find a lot to like. Far from Hollywood, these independent films have license to make far more provocative statements than you might find in your typical mainstream classic. Take Two will go beyond looking at the same old Hollywood classics you've already seen dissected in dozens of video essays. We're going further off the beaten path, delving into films created by women, people of color, and LGBTQ artists, both in front of and behind the camera. As we shine our small, humble spotlight on independent art house and international cinema, hopefully you can uncover some unseen cinematic gems. Speaking of which, Daylight Interactive is currently doing its own independent horror series focusing on the 7 deadly sins. If you haven't gotten your monthly fill of spook, you can check out the first episode on this website, produced and directed entirely by women filmmakers. I'm Emily Pinto. Tune in to our next episode of Take Two.